Welcome to SIMA's first panel discussion for the film Elemental. My name is Emmanuel Vaughan-Lee. I'm the director and producer of Elemental, and today I am joined by two wonderful panelists. We have with us Katharina Rall from the Human Rights Watch and Joshua Sheridan Fouts, the executive director of Bioneers. So welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So we wanted to dive in today right away with sharing of some pretty great news that we've gotten yesterday, a follow-up of some news we had 2 weeks ago, which is that the Indian government, Indian courts recently recognized the Yamuna and Ganges River as living entities, that they are going to have the same rights as human beings, and followed up yesterday with the news that the glacial sources of these rivers are also going to be recognized as human beings. So I'd love to just dive in by asking you guys, what does this mean, and what are the impacts that this could have both on an environmental level and a human level? So, Katharina, do you want to jump right in?
Sure, thank you. The focus of my work at Human Rights Watch is really to look at the human impacts of environmental issues. So we look at the effects of toxic pollution on people who, for example, use water that's been polluted, or we look at the impacts of climate change on indigenous communities. So we really focus on how environmental changes and especially environmental degradation affects people. And so from that perspective, I think that the development that you just mentioned in India is actually makes me somewhat hopeful, because I think what we are seeing in our research is that very often the kind of destruction of natural ecosystems is something that the people who rely on these ecosystems are experiencing in a very dramatic way. And so I think there's a lot of hope that if there's more attention to protecting the natural environment that's so important for their livelihoods, that this can also make a real difference for people's lives.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Joshua here. I think it's also an incredibly exciting move, and to frame for the listeners and viewers out there, we take sort of a complementary and slightly more expansive approach to Katharina's focus, which is also critically important. We look at both the impact of nature on humans and the impact of humans on nature. We see the two as interrelated and interdependent, and so it's critical to look at how we preserve this interconnectedness that we're experiencing between all beings. One of the things that some of the feedback I got in response to the giving peoplehood to the rivers in India was that some caution from people in India that Prime Minister Modi not use this as a political effort to be exclusive to some humans and inclusive of others. And I think it's really, really critical that we think about that. But from a standpoint of protecting the rights of nature, I think it's a critical win. And I've actually got, as I mentioned earlier, I got off a call just yesterday where there are some other people who are trying to make more movements to add personhood to additional rivers in New Zealand and possibly the US.
Thank you, Joshua. When we made Elemental, we were following Rajendra in his journey down the Ganges in October and November of 2010. And so 7 years later, it's really inspiring to see some of those efforts starting to pay off, because you guys who saw the film heard what Rajendra said about the river, how people have become so disconnected from viewing it as sacred and how they treat it in a very disrespectful way. For so many people in India, this is the sacred goddess that represents so much about their culture. And to treat it with such disregard was something he felt he needed to stand up and fight against. And 7 years later, things are starting to make change. So in thinking about some of the themes we wanted to talk about today was, how are we able to think about the long-term impacts of our work today, and looking at the role what we're doing right now is going to have in the future. So it's picking up on that theme. Both of you guys work so much to try and shed light on injustices, share inspiring stories of people creating change around the world, whether it is the social impacts on our environment and people who are trying to address that, or these connections between the social environmental issues and the interconnections between those. So I'd love if you guys could talk a little bit about how in your work you're seeing positive impacts and inspiring stories that can help people see what's possible in the work that they can participate in. Joshua, want to jump right in?
Sure. For the viewers in the audience who aren't familiar with Bioneers, Bioneers is we're going into our 28th year, and we are a sort of one of the preeminent gatherings that highlights what I would call solutionaries, or people who are focused on practical solutions for environmental and social justice. And one of the key themes that has been an interest of Bioneers at our annual conference, and everyone in the audience is invited, it'll be this October in San Francisco, but one of the key themes that's come out is the focus on not only the rights of nature, but intelligence in nature. And so we've been exploring how some of the speakers we featured last year and will be featuring this year explore how there is innate intelligence in nature in a way that is completely mind-blowing, from sea slugs on up, and so that it's honoring and looking at how that intelligence in nature can inform a deeper understanding of how we're all connected to nature that really excites us. There was a speaker last year, Mark Plotkin. For the people who are watching us on the online, I guess everyone's watching us online, but I think you can go a little bit to your left, and there's some resources, and there's a video of Mark Plotkin, and also a video of our founder, Kenny Ausubel, speaking about intelligence in nature. And I'm really excited about the fact that more research is starting to come up in this. And I can wax poetic about this, but there was a speaker in 5 seconds, a speaker named Monica Modigliano, who's based in Australia, who actually was studying intelligence in seeds. And she found that seeds actually have the ability to hear. If you put a chili seed around and surround it with corn seeds, within like an inch or so, when the chili seed starts to sprout, the corn seeds will sprout in directions going away. So they are actually able to hear and connect on a vibrational level that you can actually hear with the human ear. Anyway, these kinds of things you can extrapolate out, but it's all a broader interest in, if we are paying attention to human welfare and our welfare on the planet Earth, we need to concurrently pay attention to its interaction with us.
Thanks, Joshua.
Yeah, this is Katharina. I can maybe just kind of follow up and explain a little bit. I think there's a parallel to what Joshua has been saying about how we can learn from nature itself. And I think in our work, as I said, we are a research and advocacy organization, and we base our work mostly on interviews that we do with people who are affected by human rights abuses. And we often in these interviews, we talk to people who are very closely connected to nature because they've just been living in their natural environment and have been relying on the natural environment for all their life and for generations. And I think for those of you who have watched Elemental, you'll also see that kind of reflected in the film about how people, and I'm thinking specifically and also now of indigenous peoples, how closely connected they are to nature. And I think for us as researchers and as an organization that's trying to support these communities, what that means is also listening closely to what they have to say about environmental changes and about how these changes affect them. And we, for example, did research on climate change and the impact of climate change on indigenous communities in Kenya, in a very dry area in Kenya that's been really prone to drought for generations. And people are, I want to say, experts really at adapting to extreme weather events and to just droughts that last forever. But what these communities have been telling us is that they see that there is a difference, that in recent years it's gotten worse for them, and they're so good at just observing what's happening, how the climate changes, that in some ways they can be even kind of ahead of what we have already confirmed by scientific studies. And part of this is that there aren't that many scientific studies out there for particular regions, such as, for example, northern Kenya. But there is one, and that one actually confirms what these communities have been telling us on a kind of scientific level. They also were able to see increases in temperature that are far beyond what we see at the global average level. But I think it's really important to kind of also look at that traditional knowledge that communities have, and just generally looking at what local communities are asking for and listening to them, because I think they're the ones who are best placed to also come up with solutions. And in cases like the one we discussed earlier, in India, where there might be even conflict and kind of different interests from different communities, I think it's so important to include the people who are immediately affected and to have them sit at the table and come up and discuss what could be done.
Thank you, Katharina. I mean, kind of picking up on both of your points, there is increasing awareness of the value of listening to indigenous people and their connections to the natural world and valuing traditional ecological knowledge, and leaders in the field like those who were speaking of Bioneers, who are talking about the need to look at nature as something that is part of us and connected on a much deeper level, whether that be culturally or spiritually and scientifically. But for the most part, most people don't want to go to the depths of looking at, what's happening beyond surface level issues. They can talk about climate change, they can talk about environmental crisis, but they don't necessarily want to dive in on a philosophical or spiritual level to what's wrong with our natural world and how have we become so removed from nature and the impacts that is having. So I'd love to hear you guys talk about that. How have you seen that changing, the questions that raises, things that people can think about when they talk about, the deeper crisis that we're all facing. Joshua, you want to dive in?
I'll jump in. Well, one of the people who's featured in your documentary, Ariel Deranger, who's actually a Bioneers board member, is a great exemplar of, I think, the answer to your question. And I can give you a little bit more background. While the first part of this conversation was really about environmental justice, this is now moving into sort of more of a social justice realm. And Katharina's work is very much, and we are super fans of the work of Human Rights Watch and their social justice efforts. And we are sisters in arms, if you will. But about a decade ago, Bioneers was approached by the top Native American and Indigenous elders, and they asked Bioneers for sovereign space at our gathering. And so we gave it to them because very much at the fundaments of the creation of Bioneers was, how can we listen to Indigenous wisdom, which has tens of thousands of years of knowledge that are practically applied to surviving and thriving on this planet, and apply it in a practical way to current issues. And so how this is expressed is there's an event at Bioneers called the Indigenous Knowledge Forum, and it's curated entirely by elders in the Native American communities and Indigenous communities from around the world, and it's one of the most popular parts of Bioneers. But at that gathering, what you have is Indigenous people speaking from their own cultural perspective, and part of their filter is not just a practical concern about how to preserve and protect their well-being. And what we've found, and another thing that we end up discussing at Bioneers a lot, is that marginalized communities, such as people whose skin color is darker, African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans, often end up being pushed to live in areas in which they're exposed to far more environmental disasters than people of fairer skin. And that's an incredible social injustice and environmental injustice. But what's come out in the Indigenous Knowledge Forum is that integrated into the Indigenous wisdom of how to survive and thrive in a rapidly changing planet is a deep connection with spirit and nature. And so it's been a fascinating and really instructive lesson for all of us. And what we've seen is that the voices of Indigenous people like Ariel, are actually rising and becoming much more prominent, certainly in the last several years. And your documentary, I think, really captures that than we've seen in a long time. And so I kind of would like to say that it's a trend. And if you look at Standing Rock, look at the visibility and the attention that Standing Rock got, not just from First Peoples, but also from communities who are not of Indigenous ancestry. So I'm really excited about that trend and that movement.
Thank you, Joshua. Katharina?
Yeah, I think I can only echo what Joshua has been saying. That's really very much our experience doing this kind of research and working with communities. We see as really one of our most important roles there to bring out those voices and kind of give them a forum, a platform, kind of reach to be heard. And and for kind of this traditional knowledge and kind of spiritual connection that people have to become part of the larger conversation. And maybe one way to do this, or one area where I think this is very important, is that we do our work based on the international human rights system. So this is a framework that basically means that every government has obligations towards their own citizens and to protect their rights. And as part of these discussions, I think that it's very important to have kind of that input as well. And we are basically with our reports and with our advocacy, we are trying to push governments, but also businesses, to listen to what these communities have to say and to listen to their concerns, but also to their knowledge, and to kind of take that into account as they're making decisions. And we do that at the national level, but then also at the international level. For example, that's another good example for what Joshua has been saying. I think the discussion about indigenous knowledge has made a lot of progress over the past couple of years at the international climate change negotiations. So they're just about to set up a platform to really make this part of the formal process. And I think there's still a lot of work that has to be done. It's going the right direction, but I also know from many of our partners that they're not satisfied with there's still a lot of things that are missing, and they're not getting the kind of attention that they deserve from the governments very often.
Thank you. And there is this growing trend. We're seeing traditional ecological knowledge have a place in negotiations and conversations that it didn't even a decade ago. And Standing Rock changed the way everybody around the world started to think about the power of prayer and spiritual, cultural knowledge in response to ecological issues, and has kickstarted a whole movement that is transforming so much. And yet at the same time, we're dealing with an administration and a situation which is running completely counter to that. And so I'd be interested in hearing your perspectives as to how people can hold those two realities at the same time, and what ways that we can build resilience and support these emerging trends that are incredibly transformative, at the same time dealing with a Keystone XL pipeline, which is back on the table again, and Standing Rock being not what we thought it was going to be a few months ago. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Katharina, do you want to go first, or should I?
Sure. To make it more interesting, we switched the order. I can totally, I feel the same way. I feel that there are a lot of challenges, and it's a difficult situation for everyone. Certainly those of us who live in the US, but also outside of the US, because environmental policies, and especially climate change policies, have an immense impact not only on the US, but worldwide. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. At the same time, from my perspective, I would say that we need to work with the tools we have, and there are actually a lot of things out there, and a lot of also consensus, even just at the international level, but also at the national level. There is really a large number of people who believe in these fundamental values, including the international human rights framework that includes government obligations to respect rights. And I think what we need to be doing is to watch closely what the administration is doing, and to call them out when they don't respect rights, and especially this is having an impact, what we're kind of expecting on marginalized communities, and I think that's going to be all of our job, and it's more important than ever. At the same time, as someone who also works a lot internationally in other countries, I would say that the situation that the US is facing now is something, not necessarily exactly the same situation, but the kind of challenges with their own government is something that many people all over the world, and many local groups that are very active, are facing. And I think we can also kind of look at some of the things that they are doing, and to kind of learn from that, and that's maybe a piece of hope that I have, that I think there's a chance that the kind of global movement can also grow in that particular challenge.
Thank you.
So I got to spend the weekend, this past weekend was the Bioneers board meeting, and I got to spend it with two Canadian Indigenous activists, Ariel Deranger, who's featured in your documentary, and Clayton Thomas Mueller, who works for 350.org. And of course, they're neighbors to the United States, and they have a very different take on, and a very interesting perspective. And they said a very interesting thing. They said they actually see the reversal, or the attempted reversal, of so many policies that our society had begun to see as perhaps normal and accepted, as an opportunity. And the opportunity that they said is they feel like the election of Trump as president has sort of removed the veil of some of the most problematic elements at the heart of US culture. And it's actually given them a greater point, an opportunity to have a much more acute message, and to work even harder. And the thing that I've noticed is that I think a lot of people are a lot more awake. Those of us who might have accepted over the last 8 years that a general recognition and acceptance of climate disruption as reality, and a lot of the policies that, while the Obama administration in the US wasn't perfect, there were many policies that I think people took, maybe if not for granted, accepted that they were moving forward. And I think this has been a wake-up call that actually there's so much more work to be done. And these two Canadian Indigenous activists said, and the opportunity against the backdrop of someone who's so glaringly out of step with how we believe and understand most of humanity to feel is a great opportunity. And I would echo Katharina's point that this politically regressive effort is actually not localized to the United States. You see it in Brazil. We see it in so many different countries where people were incredibly conservative, anti-environmental movements have now moved into office. And it's an opportunity for those of us who believe in the importance of protecting our planet and the social justice and welfare issues of humans to work even harder. And we now have these great bully pulpits to point against. And again, I'll just sort of, my third, I guess, and final point is that I believe that this is a call to action for all of us, organizations like Human Rights Watch and Bioneers and the ACLU, to stand together and work even harder together, because our work now is called upon, and we are called upon to do the work that we're doing, and the critically important messaging that you're doing, Emmanuel, through storytelling, that all of us need to actually feel impelled and compelled and propelled to work even harder on telling these stories and to do it together.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from you guys about what are things that you would encourage people, who aren't at an organizational level, who aren't storytellers, but are just tuned in today because they care about what's happening to our planet. They're compelled to, learn about stories like those we told in Elemental with Jay and Ariel and Rajendra, about ways they can actually utilize this opportunity that you just described, that Clayton and Ariel are saying, look, the emperor has no clothes. Let's wake up. This is an opportunity. What are ways people can actually get involved at a deeper level that also honors the themes that we talked about in the film and that we raised earlier on in the panel discussion about, the real connection to nature and the opportunity to go deeper in looking at this crisis, and not just say, yes, we're going to drive Priuses and we're going to think about, cutting back coal production. But it's like we're talking about a fundamental shift in a way of perceiving our relationship to each other and the natural world. And so what are ways you would encourage people to use this opportunity to go deeper and then act from that place of depth?
So, Katharina, should we keep the...
Yeah, just maybe speaking also from my own experience, I think for me, and a really important element of how I came to do this work, and now it's actually my job, but I started doing volunteer work at a local level, and I feel that this is something that really made me feel connected to a lot of issues that were going on in the community where I lived at the time, and kind of learning about other people's experience, learning about social justice issues, learning about environmental issues. And I feel that's for many people, this can be a way to kind of connect beyond, just this general concern that we all share and we all have about what's going on. So I would say get engaged, do something at the local level. That's just something that may seem really small, but I think it's very important to kind of act locally and to have also for yourself to have the feeling to be part of this movement and to be part of the solution. Obviously, there are many things that people can do. You know, it starts with all the marches that are going on, but they're really even just smaller things, really at the community level that I think can be very, very valuable. So that's kind of one part, and the other one is related to what we were talking about earlier, which I think is so important in the U.S. but also worldwide, for people to speak up, you know, publicly, and to kind of call their representatives, talk to people they know, even in their own family, tell them about why they care, why it's important. And I think that's going to be crucial. It's also really important for activists, the Ariel and other activists that are featured in the film. I think they also really, really depend on kind of support from the general public, and it's not enough to just kind of listen to them, but to really say, this is something I care about. And unfortunately, we see that increasingly people who work to protect the environment and who work to protect the land are often under threat in many countries. They're receiving death threats. Some people are even killed. They are working in really difficult environments. So I think it's also an important part of kind of valuing what they're doing is to kind of protect them and hold their governments to account to make sure that they're safe to do this work.
Thank you. Yeah, I would echo that. This is our call to action to show up. One of the ways that we're curating this year's Bioneers gathering is about we always are focused on practical solutions, but we're now really looking on how we can empower people to understand the systems that are around us. But there are basic things that you can do. There's a whole infrastructure in the United States that allows and informs people to become politically active. People should run for office if that's something that's in your motive. People should support and patronize the arts. I absolutely agree with Katharina's point about supporting the activists who are at the tip of the spear. Being a participant in local community gatherings. This is the time for us to come out of from behind our laptops and get out into the and join community. And I think it's an interesting one because over the last decade, the growth of the internet has both been an asset and a challenge. It makes it very convenient for us to sit behind our laptops, and I actually think now we're called upon to take action in the physical space. And so I think there's a bit of a cultural revolution going on, and I'm excited about that. But this is the time to seek community and be present with them physically.
Great. Thank you, Joshua and Katharina. We're coming to the end of our time here today, and I just thought I'd end by sharing, a little bit of my experience, as a filmmaker, telling these stories, and then reflecting on their impact several years later and how that's relevant in light of what's happening. And the theme that always comes to me when I think about, what Ariel and Jay and Rajendra accomplished and struggle with is their resilience and the need for having resilience on an individual and community and societal level right now. And really looking at things in a longer term capacity, in a way. I think that, what was so inspiring about seeing how all of the characters we featured in the film live their lives is that they look at this as a lifelong commitment. They look at this as something that's going to be unfolding beyond their lives, and that is actually a fuel for them. That is not something that is going to make them think, well, I've got to see short-term gains in order to be able to continue doing this work. And I think that the challenges we're facing and the opportunity we have, whether it's in the Trump administration or elsewhere around the world, to kind of wake up to what's happening, is to actually connect with our own resilience on every level and try and live that in every way we can. So that was the message that came from me from when I was, making this film and reflecting on it. And I think it's a message which is important for us to consider today. So we'll close on that note. I would encourage everybody to check out what Bioneers is doing. Incredible work, incredible people. Check out what's happening at Human Rights Watch and the work that they are doing and the stories they're telling. It's important for us to be aware and to take action. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for checking out the film, and we look forward to connecting with you again offline.